There was something that happened that got a lot of you bent out of shape over NFL draft weekend, wasn't there? A lot of folks love Jake Fromm. I don't have anything against Jake Fromm. I was on the field at Notre Dame Stadium when he had to, in impromptu fashion, make his college debut. Remember, Jacob Eason got hurt in game one, so Jake Fromm takes the field in South Bend and leads Georgia to a very, very close victory on the road at Notre Dame. Think about driving around sometimes. Driving around, I live in Nashville right now. Sometimes, especially these days because there's nothing else to do, sometimes I'll just kind of drive out in the country during the afternoon. I also have to learn my bearings around here, so that's another reason. I'm driving back the other day. There's a detour. I can't see any construction going on. It makes no sense to me. It took me 20 minutes out of my way. I was not happy about it at all. And I never found out what the detour was for. I just have to assume that it was valid. I have to assume that construction workers weren't just trying to hamper my schedule. 98% of the time, you never find out the context of the detour. Think about Georgia football this past year. And I want you specifically, speaking of Notre Dame, to think about this past year's Notre Dame game. It was the return trip. They went to Notre Dame in 2017. Notre Dame comes to Athens in 2019. You Georgia fans remember this game? Of course you do. It was big. It was a very memorable atmosphere. Do you guys remember what the talk was afterwards? You won it. You didn't cover. Very close game. Quote unquote, a lot closer than the experts thought it was going to be. You got the win, but there was an argument afterwards. And the argument, and I was very, very passionate on the other side of most of you. You argued that your play calling offensively in this game was too conservative. And you argued that you made things a lot harder on yourselves than it needed to be. And I argued on the other side. I said, I think it was a brilliantly called and brilliantly handled game because Kirby Smart and his staff know exactly what they have, way better than most of you do, way better than all of you do, let's be honest. And they called the game in the manner that they thought best suited them to win the game. And that's what they did, and they won the game. And there was never a whole lot of fear about Georgia not winning that game. Well, what have we learned since then? Because just like the detour, 98% of the time I said you never find out the context. You never find out why that detour was there. I think there's some context being provided to us right now. Did you watch the NFL draft? Did you see Jake Fromm fall to the 5th round? And I use fall in a very intentional manner. No one falls in the draft. They're just drafted where they get drafted. It doesn't matter what a magazine says. It doesn't matter how much the media was in love with you before the season. Nothing you say at SEC Media Days, unless you admit to having a body in your trunk, is really going to impact what happens in the draft several months later. You are who you are as a player. The thing is, sometimes people get fooled. And they get fooled by how charming you are, how smart you are, how relatable you are, how clean-cut an image you have. None of these are bad things. They just don't really have all that much to do with where you're going to get drafted. What do we know now, though, maybe that we didn't know, let's say that Saturday in Athens? What we know is you had an awesome home field atmosphere that night. You had a very smart quarterback there in Jake Fromm who lacks elite physical traits. You had an elite defense on the field. Your opponent in Notre Dame was not with the ability to capitalize offensively. They were not going to move up and down the field. They did not possess explosive elements offensively. You had a sizable overall roster advantage. You add all that stuff up. Remember, physical limitations at the quarterback position. How would you manage that game? All those ingredients, put them in the pot, pour it out. What gives you the best chance to win? Now we get context. Now you know. Now you see what the 32 NFL general managers and their army of scouting departments thought about Jake Fromm. None of them, not a single one out of 32, viewed him as worth any more than a 5th-round selection. But preview magazines told you that you had a first-round caliber quarterback on your roster. And so it just boggled your mind how Georgia wouldn't be ultra-aggressive in their passing game. Kirby Smart and James Coley, whom he never criticized as much as you guys did, take note, looked at their same roster, knowing it much better than you, and said, the only way we're probably going to lose this game is if we take risks through the air. And they didn't. And they managed their roster in the best way that gave them the best chance to win, and they did. Now, in retrospect, knowing what Jake Fromm lacked, you see why Georgia handled things the way they did a lot of times offensively this past year. That's in the past. As we look forward, here's the biggest question for Georgia. Can't change any of that. Is there change coming? Because the best way, you can marry two things here. Two things can be true. It could be true that Kirby Smart thought in 2019, given his ingredients, the best way to go about things was a more conservative offensive approach. Let's not lose it. Let's game manage this thing, to steal a term from yesteryear, and let's win on dominant defense, and let's be really sound in special teams, and let's win the turnover battle. Maybe that is the way that he wanted to go about it in 2019. That doesn't mean that that's the most preferable way that he'd love to go about it in the future. It's just what he had at the time. So that's the big question here. Is that just who Kirby Smart is? They used to say that about Nick Saban all the time. Is that just Nick Saban? Is that his MO? Does he just want to get a quarterback that's smart enough, not lose them a game, and then they're going to win by suffocating their opponent? They're just going to, wrap around their neck and slowly choke them to death, and they're going to lean on them with that superior roster, and over 4 quarters, the Bama factor will win out. Well, once upon a time it was. Then all of a sudden it wasn't anymore. Who's to say Kirby Smart doesn't undergo the same philosophical evolution? Who's to say Georgia's offense doesn't undergo the same kind of evolution? I'll just tell you this. Jamie Newman got a white-hot spotlight on him now, just like Monken, new offensive coordinator there. White-hot spotlight, because there's a lot of talk. You miss spring. So that was your install period. You missed spring. There's a lot of talk and a lot of expectation that even with a dominant defense again, and even with sound special teams play and a really good roster advantage over 99 out of 100 teams they face, even with all those elements still there, there's an expectation that offensively they're going to overhaul a lot. So we'll see. That's the big question with Georgia, and it's going to be until finally toe meets leather this fall.